Welcome to Christian Conversations with Strathern United Church. As we walk through the season of Advent, Reverend Sandy offers historical perspectives regarding the Nativity of Jesus. He describes the two stories as told in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the imperfection of Jesus' arrival in the world, and how the stories are different. This is an imperfect story, however it is told. How have we come to understand this story as needing perfection in our Christmas celebration? How do we carry both parts of this season in our hearts? Thank you for joining us. We hope that you find messages here to support your understanding and celebration of Christmas.
Well, that's good to be here as always. And as we get ready to, this is the lecture part of the conversation for next Thursday. And we're going to be talking about Christmas, the gap between perfection that the society demands and the reality of the world around us. I'm going to do a whole whack of background context, the usual bits and pieces that allows everyone else to have a conversation next week. A lot of this is going to be kind of personal musings and personal reflections from my own experiences. But before we start, let's just have a moment of prayer. God, we gather in your name in this time. We gather as we prepare for the journey of Advent, the celebration of your incarnation in all its imperfection in the midst of a broken world. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some personal confessions. I've often talked about the three worlds of interpreting biblical stories and biblical texts, and in this case, I have to fully own my own experiences. Growing up in a culture that was a bit of an anomaly when it comes to the celebration of Christmas in the English-speaking world. I always like to joke about the fact that when it came to the war on Christmas, the Puritans were amateurs compared with the Church of Scotland. I grew up in a culture that did celebrate Christmas. Christmas was, but it was not the emotional crippling affair it could be for many people. And I've often joked about the challenge of being a minister celebrating Christmas services and like with an attitude like ho hum meh. My running joke has always been, I'd like to be the minister who one day is reported on the local news channels as being the person who ruined Christmas for everyone in the Christmas Eve service, because I used to grow up with stories like that. What do I mean by all of that? The theme we're going to be looking at is, what does the Christmas story actually tell us in the Gospels? And why did it get to Coca-Cola, AI ads and all that, the whole palaver of a season that probably causes the most stress in Christendom? Another childhood memory just popped in. I don't know if it's actually true or not, but this was a scene in a Scottish police detective show, Taggart. Main character was a very cranky, very kind of almost obnoxious police detective who no one likes. He's very bitter, very whatever. And I remember as a kid watching this scene where he's arguing with his daughter about Christmas, and he's got his delusion about having a nice Christmas, and she rattles off all these stats about how awful Christmas is, like the family violence and all this kind of stuff. And like so many things, it's stuck in my head. I don't know if it's actually true or not. My own personal memories of Christmas are not exactly hallmark memories. In fact, I joke the best Christmas I had was when a friend from university visited, so everyone had to behave themselves. And it worked. These days, just as a personal kind of, I actually enjoy Christmas. Jen and I have a nice Christmas. We just chill at home. We have our little rituals. We can give each other gifts. I make a nice simple Christian chicken stew for dinner. We do our usual bits and pieces. We have a couple of traditions, like we watch the Christmas version of Corner Gas, which I certainly recommend as a Christmas tradition. I watch Sherlock Holmes. So anyway, that's where I am. That's, I don't know if it's too much information or not, but I guess it helps to understand where I'm coming from, where I find this time of year to be an interesting challenge, because The other aspect of all of this is the kind of the paradox. I came into the church at this time of year. I came into the church the Sunday after Christmas. That's when it was my moment of epiphany, a week early, which, no surprise as far as I'm concerned. So I have this kind of paradox of the season is like, yeah, ho hum. At the same time, I actually became a Christian at this time of the year after the songs have been sung, after the angels and whatever go. So I'm going to talk a lot of things about, as I said, my own experiences, but I'm going to start off with scripture. What is the earliest version of the birth of Jesus? It's not Mark. It's not the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul, what Paul says about Jesus is he was born of a Jewish woman. That's it. Mark has no interest. As far as he's concerned, Jesus is from Bethlehem. The first narratives of the birth of Jesus that we have recorded are in the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospels of Luke. And they are very different stories. One of the things that sticks with me in this time of year is watching these Christmas pageants where they ram everything together and all happens on the same night. And I'm going like the scriptural purist I am, like, oh, does it work? Does it work? Does it work? And, why is the wise man there? They turn until Epiphany. And people look at me like, what's wrong with you? I'm being pedantic. Humor me. This is why I don't get invited to Christmas pageants. But this is part of the kind of what we've done. We've taken two very different stories, and they're actually quite harrowing stories, particularly the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew's story is actually quite terrifying what happens. And we cutesy it up. It becomes domesticated. And I think I'll spend some time on the Gospel of Matthew story because I think it's very, 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 very relevant in this present circumstances, particularly with what's happening to our neighbours down south and their whole war against immigration. What is terrifying about the story of the Gospel of Matthew, the birth narrative? Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Why? To fulfill prophecy. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That prophecy suddenly becomes important. The three wise men, except for the word free, we don't know how many there were. It could be 2, 10, could be an army of wise men. We somehow just labeled it, stuck with 3 because of the gifts. 3 gifts, 3 men. Sense, right? They may have chipped in. Like, I don't want to be flip or anything like that. The gifts are actually quite odd. Gift of gold. Why would you, gold is something you give to kings. Why would you give it to an ordinary family? They probably couldn't even use the gold because that would mean a sign of suspicion. Where did they get the gold from? Who did they steal it from? There's a whole bunch of stuff. And then frankincense and myrrh. Yeah, here's the stuff we're going to use to prepare your body for burial. Happy birthday, little boy. Like, yeah. It'd be like me turning up at a baptism afterwards and say, here's your burial plot. The gifts mean something. The gifts are a symbol. And then there's the real terror. The massacre of the innocents. The wise men go to Jerusalem in the first place. They don't go to Bethlehem. They're confused. They don't know. They want to know where this King of the Jews will be born. And they turn up at the court of King Herod, who is not well known for his fondness for other people who might take over his throne. He was not very even-tempered about it. He is like, yeah, tell me more, please. Where do you think this child will be born? Oh, pardon me while I take this knife out. And once they visit the kid, they're warned, get out of Dodge. Why? Because King Herod orders an execution of all the children in that area, all the male children of a certain age span. He sends in the death squads. Because of the death squads, Jesus' family flees to Egypt. They become refugees. Now, what is fascinating is watching white Christian nationalists and their ilk desperately trying to explain. And one of the things is really like, oh, come on, please just give it up. Well, they weren't really refugees because Egypt was also part of the Roman Empire. Therefore, they weren't really refugees. I was like, for the love of Pete, just shut up. They fled. They got out of the client kingdom of Galilee because they didn't want to die. They were refugees. They were refugees fleeing persecution. Now, the interesting thing is there could be some historical truth behind this story in Matthew, in that there was a rebellion in the Nazareth region, and it did look like there was extensive violence suppressed. So what could have happened? And I'm quite happy to accept, because it's that the story of Jesus's family fleeing to Egypt could have an historical kernel, in that his family were involved in this rebellion in the Galilee and they did flee to Egypt. That could well be true. Was it because of Herod's death squads? Well, this is the weird thing. The reason we know that probably didn't happen is because it's not recorded. And what I mean by that is all his other atrocities were across it. And so it's like he wasn't guilty of that crime because he was committing other crimes. Like, okay, that works. So we have this whole horrifying story of death squads, refugees, the absolute horror of human politics. And Jesus is born in the midst of this. So that's one story. That's the story of the Magi. Second story. Look, we do this story every year. It's a good story for the Christmas narrative. It's got all the shepherds and the angels and all this kind of stuff. Just kind of brief side view about the angels. I wrote a fan fiction story. I write fan fiction for one of my favorite series, Other Side Picnic. And I had the story was that they were visited by the angels. Now, I decided to go for the biblically accurate route. And I used some of the description of the angels from Ezekiel, and like what talks about massive rings of fire from whole bunches of eyes that's all circling around. And I said, these things were crying out from the sky, be not afraid. And the characters in the story were shooting at them because they were scared witless, because they looked nothing like human beings. I make that point because there is terror, there is fear, there is a whole whack of a bunch of emotions going on in these stories that we have domesticated. Luke's story sounds nice in terms of historically accurate. There was a survey, census and such and such. In the emperor, like he is placing Jesus within the context of the Roman Empire. Now the details are a little shaky, and the rules are even more shaky. Would the Emperor Augustus order a census to move whole populations all over the place so they could register in the home of their ancestral bloodline? No. That would cause a lot of confusion, a lot of upset. People would not be traipsing all over the place. Luke wants Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. So he creates this narrative where Jesus has to go to Bethlehem, or Jesus' family has to go to Bethlehem. And he puts it in the context of the Roman Empire, because Luke is writing for a Roman Gentile audience. He wants to say, this is where Jesus is born. This is how he starts to become the King of Kings. So we have this whole palaver of traipsing to Bethlehem and the whole business of there's no room at the inn, once more to make some point about the God being born in the full imperfection of humanity. We have the shepherds being the first to honor Jesus. And we hear, when it's interesting, we hear of the fear and terror of the shepherds. That is also what we'll hear at the end of the Gospels, the fear and terror of the women as they flee the empty tomb. The encounter with the awesome majesty of God, the awesome majesty of the good news that shakes everything, that completely upsets your worldview. So you have two very distinct stories with very profound emotional stuff going on, heavy stuff going on, that talk about the incarnation of God among us, and we domesticate them. We domesticate them. We turn them into cute little stories, cute little kids dancing around, the whole thing, and there's all so nice. And I just obviously I sound like an absolute grouch saying all this, like you miserable Scottish Presbyterian. I just struggle with the whole concept of the domestication of something that's supposed to change everything. It just becomes part of the backdrop. So those are the stories that we have. That's the kind of construct. The larger issue, and I'll be actually addressing this in the sermon on Sunday, so I'm not going to get away too much, but the whole question of prophecy. One of the key developments in the developing of the Christian scriptures was the connections that they were desperate to make with the First Testament, particularly the prophets. This was something they felt was that this needed to be established. I'm not even sure why, to be honest, apart from maybe to give it more gravitas, because one of the challenges that Christianity faced in the Roman world was it was seen as a cult. The Romans looked upon Christians the way we used to look on Hare Krishna, for anyone who remembers the Hare Krishna. Those of us who are old enough to remember that there used to be Hare Krishna cults in our. The Romans did not think of Christians as having much respect. They weren't crazy in the Jews either, but at least they felt the Jews had the tradition, the religion, they had been around. They even created stories where the prophet Moses was talking to Greek philosophers and all this kind of palaver. So the Jewish religion, the Jewish community had tradition, it had gravitas. The Romans still didn't really care for them, and the Greeks didn't really care for them, but there was some kind of grudging respect. The Christians didn't have that. Christians had, they were a weird, bizarre cult whose founder didn't like Romans. So the Christian writers started to want to connect Christianity with Judaism. So the idea of prophecy, the idea of the prophets preparing the way for Jesus. Now, the prophets would often talk about a figure, some kind of messianic figure who would come and restore the covenant. One of the most infamous examples is Isaiah 7:13, 7:14, where Isaiah talks, a young woman will give birth and set the whole. That became a young woman, a virgin shall give birth, and you know where that's going. The Greek translation that led to the cult of the Virgin Mary, then that's probably another topic. But there's this whole, they would go through the book of Isaiah, the book of Micah. We'll hear it in this week's readings as well. This idea of the prophets preparing the way. Now, what I will be saying on Sunday is it's time to reevaluate that. And, I just traditionally was like not even talking about it. But now I've come to the sense of what are the prophets preparing us for? And how does Jesus follow that example? So that's what we'll be talking about. Traditional Christians did not want to spend much time talking about the agenda of the prophets. They just wanted to focus on Jesus being proclaimed by the prophets. When the prophets would have said, "No, we're not doing that. What we're talking about is what's going to happen, how the world is going to be changed, and how everything is going to be made new." And it's not going to be Jesus doing it. It's going to be us working on behalf. And so that's, as I said, so you have these different strands. The prophet tradition, getting Jesus born in Bethlehem, whereas Mark, interestingly, and John both don't care. Mark is the first gospel. Jesus turns up as an adult. And what we know about Jesus is, according to Mark, is that he was rooted in Nazareth. His family lives in Nazareth. He has brothers and sisters. There's no indication of blended family or any other kind of stuff. Mary and Joseph are Jesus' parents, as far as we know. John's birth narrative is this cosmic vision of Jesus always being there and one day just kind of showing up. Hi, I'm Jesus. It's Matthew and Luke. Why? They have respective agendas. Matthew is speaking to a Jewish audience, Jewish Christians. He is placing Jesus within the Jewish salvation tradition that he's part of. Luke is saying, hey, Jesus is part of the larger Gentile Roman world, but I need to do some explaining. So, two various different stories. Now, okay, so what's that got to do with the other part? Well, one of the things that we Christians have to deal with is not persecution. I want to get that straight. If you want to go and wish someone Merry Christmas, knock yourself out. The one thing we do have to deal with is on the internet is annoying people who tell us that Christmas is a pagan holiday and you lot should back off. I have to deal with these bloody emails all the time. What I mean by that is, yes, Christmas is rooted in pagan traditions. I get it. It is. No contest. But the Christmas that we celebrate is also part of our Christian tradition as well. Because Christianity, like many religions, when it comes into contact with other cultures, it will adapt and evolve. Sometimes by negotiation, sometimes by mutual understanding, and other times at gunpoint. Many of the early Christian traditions around Christmas were very much rooted in the Christian understanding of the birth of Jesus and whatever. But as they came into more contact with pagan traditions such as Saturnalia, the traditions of the Germanic peoples, the Celtic peoples and the like and such, yeah, aspects of those cultural celebrations of Christmas became part of the deal. Midwinter solstice celebrations in pagan northwest Europe around the middle of December, that time of year, were de rigueur, because in northwest Europe, December 31st is actually midwinter. Here in Canada, it is not. So that's why I feel a bit cheated every time. It's like, maybe we should move Christmas further down the line. What I mean by that is, in Northwest Europe, you would look around and January and February, you would actually start to see signs of February. So in the middle of December, you would have your celebration feast. We're making it, we're getting through it. People would get together. They would give gifts. They would have a feast. They would kill a couple of the animals that they had left, celebrate the fact we're about to make it, things are looking good. Christianity comes along and it does its thing. It starts to make connections. Rebirth, the incarnation of God among us, seems like a reasonable fit. Signs of new life. Well, the renewal of things, like it's not perfect, but there is, at that time period, there is a genuine kind of like, let's work together. The process of conversion in early medieval Europe, which we used to call the Dark Ages, but we don't anymore, tended to be mutual. There were some moments when there was force, particularly amongst some of the more Germanic tribes, but there was negotiation, conversation. How do we celebrate this midwinter feast? And you've got this Christmas business with your, if you're Jesus guy, let's have a compromise. And so Christmas becomes a time when you celebrate the incarnation of God, and it becomes a party. That's like one of my favorite lines from the anime Disappearance of Haruo Sutsumaya, when she actually says, "Who doesn't want to celebrate a birthday? Even Mr. Jesus Christ." And celebrate a birthday. Now, so far so good. We had the celebration of the incarnation in the midst of midwinter. New Hope. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's okay. And I think I often joke about that. That's one of the things that's like in Scotland, because I'm now going to get to where the things went wrong. Things started to go wrong around the Victorian period, in that images of Christmas started to become more formalized, more rooted in the family celebration, more kind of genteel. There was a whole, the change from the 18th to the 19th centuries in the UK, and therefore in many ways kind of beyond that, were a period from kind of more anything goes, let's have a riot and all this kind of stuff, and let's drink how much gin we can, into like crushing respectability. And I think one of the ways this is illustrated is the change from coffee to tea. Coffee used to be the drink amongst the hoi polloi in the UK, coffee houses and all this kind of stuff. And then tea became more popular because there's more genteel. Apparently, tea doesn't fire up the blood the same way coffee does, or at least get you up in the morning. So there was a general shift. Now, I'm also going to throw in another bit of a kind of, part of the context is the Protestant Reformation and the certain aspects of the Protestant Reformation, particularly Presbyterian and Congregationalist. There were some people in the Protestant Reformation who did not hold with Christmas, period. One reason, because they were Protestants, was we didn't like all this Virgin Mary business. Too much fixation on the Virgin Mary. Meek and mild, well, we don't care. Others, because Christmas was too much of a good time for people. There were too many people enjoying themselves, and that was just not on amongst Puritans and Presbyterians, apparently. Now, the weird thing about Scotland is we decided we were not going to celebrate Christmas. And we actually passed laws in the Scottish Kingdom, and the laws remained in the books for years. And Scotland did not celebrate Christmas officially as a holiday until the 1950s. I would talk to my granddad. My granddad would work on Christmas Day. It was a normal day. Now, we celebrated Christmas. We had the whole meal and all this kind of stuff. But there was no tradition, no family values. It was a party. It was like back to the old days of the midwinter solstice. So a Scottish Christmas in many ways doesn't have that same level of guilt that developed of the perfect Christmas. We were like, yeah, let's look at the list here. Eat lots of food, give each other presents, maybe have a drink. And we're supposed to feel guilty about this. Why? Because it wasn't family, wasn't tradition, whatever. This artificial vision of Christmas as this kind of family unity, this kind of genteel, like the cute stories and all this kind of the cards and all this kind of stuff. I think it became crippling. And then, of course, enter capitalism. It also became this big consumerist holiday. I'm not sure the details of Coca-Cola taking over Christmas or founding Father Christmas. I think it's overblown, and I think Coca-Cola wants you to believe that because it makes them sound more important than they really are. What they did do was they took advantage of stuff that was already beginning to emerge. The evolution of Father Christmas, the evolution of Santa Claus. Father Christmas was the English Incarnation. Santa Claus was the Dutch who became the American. And so these figures, and the whole supernatural aspect that was associated with them, like the elves and all this kind of stuff, which I always found annoying. When I thought of elves in Lord of the Rings, like 2 meters tall, beautiful, whatever. And then next to be told these bloody elves up in the North Pole were little munchkins, like, yeah, not happening. So we had this whole construction of kind of Victorian folklore. And we rammed it into this Christmas celebration that had become a little bit kind of, hurly-burly and whatever. And Scotland, for example, is looking at them like, well, we have New Year's Eve, Hogmanay, we have our big thing, and you can take your Christmas and whatever, and not worry about it. Just as a personal aside, we even had our own Christmas, we had our own separate meal for New Year's Eve, a steak pie, which I can assure you is far better than any bloody turkey I've eaten. I don't, turkey's edible as far as I'm concerned, that's all. So we have this development of Christmas as this perfect family gathering time where everyone is on their best behavior and we all wear Christmas sweaters and we all kind of filled with good cheer, even when we're not filled with good cheer. The stress of the period, the stress of preparing for that moment. the whole construct of having the perfect Christmas dinner, the perfect Christmas meal, Christmas drinks from Starbucks, come in a nice fancy cup and have to be made perfect. And there's a whole, and the gifts that you have to get for one another, and all this whole construct. And Jesus is going, what? I was born, according to the stories, I was born in a manger. I was born in a stable, and I was dumped in the food trough. And then I was visited by shepherds who probably smelled pretty rank. How did you get to celebrating my birthday with the Martha Stewart Christmas special, or in some cases, all the Christmas specials? Like the whole perfection. And that's the challenge that we face. And that's the challenge. And that's one of the things we hope to talk about as well, is like that whole, how did we get here? Like, and I hopefully I've given you some context, like, some details, like history and commercialism and all this kind of stuff. But what did we do in all this process? Like, how do we get wrapped up into this vision of what is Christmas perfection? And how does it do with the incarnation? The incarnation, and maybe that's what the thing we need to start with. What was God trying to achieve? What was God hoping for by becoming one of us? Was it to save us? Was it to renew us? Was it to challenge us? These are questions that we ourselves will struggle with. But you need to kind of start asking yourselves some questions. Look at how God became one of us. God became someone who was no one. God became a Jewish peasant in the Galilee. And I can assure you, in the world of Jesus, there are not many people lower than you in the food chain than that. Slaves, enslaved people, yep, and not much more. Jesus wasn't a citizen of the Roman Empire. He was a subject of the Roman Empire. He was a subject of a client king who served at the behest of Rome. Jesus lived in the Pax Romana with very few entitlements, very few privileges. He was expected to do what he was told, pay his taxes, to keep his, to be well behaved. He was a nobody, an absolute nobody. Manual labor, like as I've mentioned before, one of the things that we do is we romanticize the fact that Jesus was a carpenter. Sorry, in the world of Jesus, that was nothing. Land was how you made your money. Jesus's family were probably landless peasants. They had no land. They had to do something. They had to work in the building sites. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic, maybe some Hebrew, spattering of Greek, because he needed to have Greek to work in the building sites. But he wasn't, he was a nobody. This is how God incarnates as one of us, as a nobody. Now, here's the interesting difference between Matthew and Luke. Matthew implies the nobility of Jesus, because the way that Matthew talks about Jesus, like, he is the son of, he's born in Bethlehem. There's no indication of what kind of life, whatever. But he still talked about someone important, like, the Magi are surprised that Herod doesn't know about this birth, because surely, someone important. And then they're probably quite surprised to discover that. Whereas Luke wants to establish from the beginning how low the circumstances were of Jesus' birth. That Jesus' family had to do what they were told by the Roman Empire. This is one of my eternal struggles. As Captain Pedantic, who loves to focus on the details, who now and again has to remember the details are not as important as I like to think they are. The details in this particular case are not as important as I like to think they are. When Luke talks about Jesus' family being sent from the census and whatever, Luke is making a point. He is speaking he is writing a truth, but the details don't match. In that, he wants you to know from the very beginning that as far as the world was concerned, Jesus was a nobody. His family had no importance. That a Roman emperor could go, and they would have to move. So Luke wants you to know that from the beginning. But despite what, the fact this is how God is incarnated amongst us, Luke, and this is one of the reasons why I'm comfortable with Luke's story. And this is one of the reasons why I can preach on it every Christmas Eve, is because I have got to this stage in my life where I've been able to tell my pedantic side, shut up. Just let me do this. Let me preach on something that is actually, there is a greater truth. And the greater truth is, this is how God becomes one of us. And Luke creates a narrative that accentuates that. It might not be factually true, he says, gritting his teeth, but there is a deeper meaning. And one of the things you have to always be very aware of the Gospels is they're not historical fact. They are theological accounts of the life of Jesus written in a way to get your attention, to get you into the story. And so Luke could have said, Jesus was a peasant who grew up in the Galilee, worked in the building sites, and then one day realized he was the Son of God. He could have said that. I personally would have been happy with that. Not a great Christmas pageant, though. What I mean by that is, it doesn't get people in the door. You don't get people, So what Luke is saying is, here is an account of the life of Jesus, how it begins, and I will make it a little bit more interesting. Is it true or not? It doesn't really matter, because what does matter, what is true, is the fundamental point. The fundamental point is Jesus comes into the messiness of the world, into the brokenness of the human condition, and he becomes as one of us. That's the point that Luke tries to stress, tries to get you to hold on to, and tells you to work with that. So as I said, when I finally grasped that deeper truth, I was able to be more comfortable with talking about Luke and the passages, because I was able to let go of my own kind of, this is not the real story. It is the real story of the imperfection. And so the challenge that we face every Christmas is, how do we go from a story, a narrative that celebrates the incarnation of God as one of us in such low circumstances, to this vision of perfection that Jesus himself would say, why? Why are you doing this to yourselves? Why are you stressing yourselves over something that I want you to have a good time? You want to celebrate my birthday? Great. Was I actually born on December 25th? Probably not. Does it matter? Well, it's like when you adopt a dog from a shelter. You don't know when the dog was born. We call it gotcha day or whatever. When Jesus comes into our lives, whatever. But do we need to pick an arbitrary date to say Jesus is born? Why not? Let's go for it. So you've got Jesus' birthday. So what would Jesus want us to do in that birthday? Well, he wanted to celebrate it. Sure. How would we celebrate that? And this is the challenge we face. The world has its own vision of Christmas. The relentless march of music. We see the parodies of, Mariah Carey and her continuing singing, all I want for you is Christmas. I saw just last night there's an alternate universe where Mariah Carey is sick and tired of hearing someone sing all they want for Christmas is, we have all these jokes, we have all these kind of ways of coping. Maybe we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what does Christmas look like for us? What is the incarnation we're celebrating? I'm lucky. have the incarnation of my faith, and that helps me to kind of. And I'm also lucky. I grew up in a culture that had a slightly different approach, so I don't deal with guilt and whatever. I enjoy working on Christmas Eve. It's to me. There's and I have my own stories of Christmas Eve. But one of my favorite stories is recognizing the specialness of a Christmas Eve in that walking by the Tim Hortons and it was closed. I was like, wow, that's amazing. It's all in darkness. I don't get it. But there are deeper stories, there are deeper truths, and I think sometimes we have those moments when we take the step out of the Christmas that has been manufactured for us, and we see those deeper truths, we see these deeper moments. And I think we need to give ourselves more permission to take those moments, to take that step back and say, what does Christmas really mean? So, for example, giving to charities. That's a great thing to do, obviously. Safeway have started doing their, make donations for the food bank, and of course, for a couple bucks, whatever. Also, and this is something we try to do here at Strathern, we've done in the past, the Blue Christmas services. I think one of the things that we need to be more conscious of is the awareness that this is not a happy season for so many people. Partly because of the stresses of Christmas itself, the stress to be perfect, the right gift, whatever. But there's also those who are dealing with loss, the burden of grief, the burden of anguish, and the empty table, the empty chair. And one of the problems, one of the profound problems of this season is it celebrates family so much. What happens to those people who have lost family? And you listen to this relentless, ongoing family celebration. It's great to have all the family there. Everyone's going to be around the table. And there are people there who are like, that doesn't work. And that, these are practical aspects of a season that has become so overwhelming. The running jokes, like, how do you know it's Christmas? Because the eggnog's appeared in the shelves. And Jen will be like, why can't we have eggnog all year round? Which is actually not a bad question, because in all the other stuff we guzzle down, like eggnog doesn't seem that bad. But all the kind of the traditions, the aspects, and then this all suddenly disappears. Like why not continue the good cheer? As I said, eggnog's actually not a bad example. Why can't we have eggnog in January? Why can't we have it in February? It's a sweet milk that's got a nice, pleasant taste to it. It's a nice treat. But it's only good for Christmas? Why? It seems an odd point for me to kind of bring up. But I think it illustrates how once it's over, it's done. And the reality is the incarnation of God is not finished on December 25th. Jesus is not born for one day and then shuffles off. The point of the incarnation is that God is with us. That's what Emmanuel means. God is with us. And so we do ourselves quite a disservice by saying to ourselves, yeah, we're not doing this. Like we've done it. Jesus is in the building and now he's gone. Christmas, maybe here's an idea. Maybe we just move Jesus's birthday to another day and we just let the pagans have the winter festival. And we can join in. And we can have our Christmas cheer and we can have our celebration and we can just have a good time and we celebrate, Is it ridiculous? Well, some people would look at what we've done with Christmas being ridiculous. I've mentioned this quite a few times. One of my biggest cultural shocks when I came over to Canada was I arrived in the beginning of December, so I had a couple of weeks before getting ready for Christmas. And I started realizing something was going to be really different about Christmas this year in Canada, my first Christmas in Canada. there was no great TV shows. British Christmas is awesome Christmas TV. They have all the Christmas special, like Doctor Who and all this kind of stuff, and all the great shows that have their Christmas specials, and now all the awesome movies becoming. This is true. One of the things we used to look forward to was getting the Christmas edition of the Radio Times and the TV Times, and then we could plan what great movies we were going to watch on what. And then, of course, I come over here and it's like a rerun of Star Trek on Christmas Day, which, yeah, great as far as I'm concerned, but it wasn't special. And it's a weird thing, but this is the kind of things that become special for us. And then we take a step back and it's like, why? Where's Jesus in all of this? And there's when I look at this idea of domestication, how did the story become domesticated? Because it was part of a prop, religious justification for a holiday without looking at what's really going on. As I said, the story of Matthew, I think, is very relevant in this day and age. The war against the immigrant, the war against the refugee, the idea that you can quite clearly proclaim Jesus was a refugee because, according to the Gospel of Matthew, his family were refugees. So why are we not talking about, why do we see so many people bending over backwards to find loopholes to try and explain to you technically he wasn't a refugee? It's like, just give it up. You're not going to win. The story of the power of empire that can tell people to move because we want to count you. What does counting you mean? It's not, it's a tool of power. It's a tool of domination that we, once more, Luke is only exaggerating. He's not, the Roman Empire could pull stunts like this. The Roman Empire could force populations to move. The Roman Empire would enslave whole populations. Julius Caesar had probably killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Gauls. No one cared because they weren't Romans. So Luke is not he's exaggerating, but he's not making this stuff up. Both Matthew and Luke are relying upon the historical context of their period to create narratives that at most exaggerate stuff that's going on to make a point about the nature of Jesus. What we have done is cleaned up those stories, domesticated them, and got rid of the troublesome aspects because it gets in the way of us celebrating a fun Christmas. That's what we tell ourselves. Well, it doesn't. From my perspective, it gives a deeper meaning to the message of Christmas. It tells us, Christians have a bad rap for many things. And one of the things we have a bad rap for is we don't want people having fun. And oddly enough, one of my earliest memories was a Christmas TV show. And I always come back to this show because, this memory. It was going on, it was using old Hollywood movies to tell history. And it was showing about, and this episode was talking about how the Christians took over the Roman Empire. And the question was, why the heck did this happen? Because it shouldn't have happened. It was probably the underlying question. And because it showed the Romans having fun, and it was a full-on 1950s version of an orgy. Like, everyone's quaffing wine, and they're all meeting and there's dancing girls and all kit and caboodle. And then it shows the Christians, and the Christians are all standing around looking towards the sky with this absolute vacant look in their face. If anyone's seen the new Apple TV show called Pluribus, you'd actually recognize the look. But they're not having fun. They're being miserable. And as I mentioned, the Puritans in particular didn't want Christmas to be celebrated because there was too much jocularity. There was too much fun happening. Eventually we get to this idea that Christmas can be more genteel fun, more kind of like, not so much of a celebration, more kind of like polite party. Maybe we should be less restrained in our celebration, because what is happening with the Incarnation is God is becoming one of us. God has heard our cries and said, I am going to act, and I'm going to do it in a spectacular fashion that maybe you should have learned from. Maybe you should have noticed I didn't come to a respectable whatever situation. I came in the midst of the poverty of this broken world. I cried my first cry, and I was heard by the lowest of the low, who I picked to welcome me into this world. So how do we get there? I don't know. Throw a couple extra bucks to the food bank donation at Safeway. That's a good start. When you wish someone happy holidays, and please wish them happy holidays, do it with gusto and cheer. Enjoy your eggnog, and and take a moment to think about those who are not going for this period, and offer genuine compassion. Be present to them. Let them set the pace of what they can have from you, and don't patronize them. Don't try and hide your joy. We get into this mindset that we can't be joyful around the people who are struggling because we'll make them feel bad. They probably will feel bad because they feel that you have to restrain yourselves. Just be open with them, chat with them, talk to them, tell them how you're going through stuff, and ask and invite them to share with you on their terms. They may not be happy with you being joyful. That's how it works. But have the conversation. I think that's the challenge that we face, is too often that we have this whole vision of Christmas being perfect, and everyone behaving themselves. Don't behave yourself. If you're broken, be broken. If you're happy, be joyful. If you're bored, find something to do. And it doesn't have to be Christmas related. And what I'm saying is, there is a deeper message that is year round. We are celebrating the Incarnation. And part of that is what happens next. What do we do next? We live our lives. We live our lives in this broken world. Okay, Christmas is over. We put the decorations away. But do we put the good news that became part of that? So hopefully that's given us some bits and pieces. I'm just going to wrap things up now, and I'm just going to close with a moment of prayer, and we'll go from there. God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the Incarnation. We thank you for your faithfulness, that we will celebrate this day as we go forward beyond the birth of your Son, to follow your Son in the world afterwards. Amen.